Hello and welcome to the cybersecurity Q&A. Today's topic is shared responsibility. When a provider such as NetSurian comes to the table with their managed XDR service, obviously we're bringing not just technology but people to the table. And so then who is responsible for which pieces? This kind of clarity is very important for all sides. Well, first of all, the shared responsibility model is a framework, and it outlines the responsibility of both the customer and NetSurian. And if it's a three-way, then also the cloud service provider if one is available. To succeed in our mission of security, every aspect must be covered. We're talking about infrastructure, endpoints, network access, operating system settings, configuration, data, the whole shooting match. If there is misunderstanding on swim lanes, why then that can lead to finger pointing, but more importantly, gaps. And these gaps are vulnerabilities that the bad guys are going to exploit. As we consider shared responsibility, there are three possible models, and they depend upon whether the customer has implemented infrastructure as a service or is hosting themselves or is using a SaaS application like Google Workspace or Salesforce or Office 365 and or has taken advantage of the components that are native to cloud providers, such as Google or AWS or Amazon, and are using their inbuilt components. This is called platform as a service. So the moment NetSurian gets involved, the customer has basically established incident response capability. And NetSurian comes to the table then with a detailed knowledge of attacker tactics. This really falls on us. And we're deploying technology in order to detect and report on indicators of compromise, on incidents, on problems. And if it's appropriate and configured, we may take action automatically. Don't just detect, but react as well. The 24/7 SOC, as part of the NetSurian Open XDR service, will analyze all of these and then, if appropriate, tune them, or if it's appropriate, escalate them to the customer after having, of course, gathered all of the incident artifacts in order to be able to answer the 5 Ws: who, what, where, when, and what do we expect you to do about it. So this is detailed remedial action. The customer or the MSP partner is expected to actually act upon this action. Notice everything in gray is the customer or the partner's job. Everything in green is primarily NetSurian's job. And after incident review is important, and this is something that NetSurian can perform as well. Upon request, we will go back and study what is it that happened in order to draw a lessons learned and what sorts of improvement might be appropriate so that this doesn't recur in the future. Now, if a cloud service provider is involved, well, that's a third group in the mix: NetSurian, the customer, and the CSP. Well, the CSP will be responsible primarily for the platform, the compute, the storage, the network, and all of those things. But all of the other stuff that belongs at the platform level is the responsibility of the customer. So where does NetSurian come in? Well, things like log analytics and things like threat intelligence and hunting performed by NetSurian on behalf of the customer. But the customer is still responsible for things like role-based access. At the network level, the CSP is doing distributed denial of service and perimeter security, but then things like log analysis, threat detection fall primarily on NetSurian, whereas access management, logical segmentation really still fall primarily on the partner or the end customer. So you've got platform and network, and above this are virtual hosts, a hardened hypervisor, a system image library. This typically comes from the CSP, leaving things like endpoint monitoring, vulnerability assessment, compliance reporting to be primarily NetSurian's problem, whereas other things such as role-based access, device hardening, host patching as primarily the customer's responsibility. At the very top of this are applications. The CSP will provide a web application firewall, but then configuring that firewall, applying multi-factor authentication, patching the application itself, this all falls on the customer's responsibility side. So you want to be fully capable in terms of security and compliance. You must consider every element. And depending upon whether you've implemented SaaS or PaaS or you're using infrastructure as a service, there are these different elements that you see on the left side of the table. And NetSurian can come in and take responsibility if we are so engaged. For example, for endpoint security, if you've chosen that option, for example, for vulnerability scanning of containers and cloud workloads. And of course, we're responsible for platform security, for data security, and so on. So this is something to consider because you must cover every element of being in the cloud. This is all very well and good, but this model, while it's been around for a while, has tended to break down in the real world. And when it breaks down, it's problematic. Let's look at some of the reasons why this model can actually be a little bit fuzzy before we propose a somewhat better one. One is plainly misunderstanding. Cloud is still relatively new. And so some extreme positions that we've seen are people say the cloud is so secure that we've got nothing left to do. The cloud provider's done it all. That's obviously not true, as you heard in the slides before. The other is the other extreme position, which says cloud is so insecure that we can't use it. And that's really not true either. The second problem in the real world is over delegation. Because the customer may not fully understand what really remains on their plate, they will make the assumption that the CSP is responsible. But you know what assume means? It makes an ass out of you and me. And so it's important to sort of read carefully what the provider has said in their documentation. Now, they say it in detail, but it's exhausting detail, and sometimes it's not really entirely obvious. The third area where this breaks down in the real world is capability versus responsibility. Now, the CSP might have said in plain language what the customer is responsible for, but that doesn't mean that the customer is capable of doing all of these things. By the way, that's specifically where providers like Netsurian come into the picture and add value, because we do this all day long and it's our thing. You can transfer some of that responsibility to us when we get engaged. Another area of breaking is default settings. Every customer, every vendor has these. And the question is, are they appropriate? A common one these days, for example, is multi-factor authentication. Is it default off or is it default on? It's such an important element of securing because identity is the new endpoint that this is something to consider. And so are you aware of what your default settings are? Have you made assumptions? Are you properly configured? And then, of course, fuzzy boundaries. Some of that over delegation, some of that misunderstanding results from a incomplete understanding of who's who in the zoo, who is doing what to whom, where, when, and how. So this is something else that must be paid attention to as you get to shared responsibility in the real world. By the way, the Cloud Security Alliance has put out a list, what they call the egregious 11. These are problems that they see. And by the way, this is ordered in sequence of occurrence and criticality. So from data breaches to misconfiguration to insufficient identity management to insider threat. And what you see in the brackets are whose responsibility it primarily falls on. Either you, the customer, and in some cases, of course, Netsurian can help you, or is it the cloud service provider? This is something to examine, and it's available on their alliance. So shared responsibility is all very well and good, but in practice, we see that this sometimes leads to finger pointing, which is unhelpful. Especially if it's a three-way finger point between Netsurian customer and the CSP. I mean, it's hard to know where one starts and where one ends. And so if you use shared responsibility as a way of dodging responsibility, that's really not useful at all. Perhaps a shared fate model is a better description. This is one that was proposed by Google. And the idea is that in this instance, Netsurian, your vendor, and yourself, Mr. Customer, along with your CSP, will work together as a team and share more than just dollars. Our responsibility is also professionally to ourselves and to our mission. And so it's not just the income, but the fact that we do this for a living. Like to be clear and transparent so that there are no fuzzy boundaries if possible, and offer some guardrails. We come to the table with vast experience in doing this and other customers. And so maybe this can be helpful to you. And the shared fate says that we succeed when you succeed. It's not just a handoff and here's what we've bought. Good luck to you. Hope it works out. We're there to you, cheek by jowl, shoulder to shoulder, fighting in the trenches. This kind of an approach really centers around customer needs. All of our customers have different needs. Some are more adept and experienced and have less need for our services, are very, very conversant. Some have more. And so one of the benefits of a Netsurian approach is that we're able to tailor the solution to your specific needs. By the way, notice that shared fate doesn't mean that the problem can be fobbed off to Netsurian or to the CSP, and you can kick back and relax on the beach. That's certainly not the case. As we pointed out in the earlier slides, there is always some responsibility that belongs to the customer. So this is a description of shared responsibility. Thank you for your attention.